right, welcome to everyone. We're so glad to have each one of you here for this reveal of our new Desert Edge. I'm Sam Campana. I'm Executive Director of the Desert Discovery Center, Scottsdale, and we are thrilled to be able to introduce to you what has really become a labor of love for all of us. We've worked hard, we've listened intently, and responded accordingly, and I think you're going to see that on the screen today. First, I'd like to share with you the team that's been working on this for this last years. On your far left is Tom Hennes from Thinc Design. They are working all over the world, but are really focused now on our Sonoran Desert, working concurrently in Dubai at an international symposium. And so all the work that we're doing here informs what they're doing, but we are the lucky recipients of all the research that they're doing for that international symposium. Next to him is our architect, John Sather from Swaback Partners. You know his work locally. You know his work at Kartchner Caverns. You know that he resided at Taliesin and brings all of that sensitivity to the desert to this wonderful project. And Duke Reiter, a senior vice president at Arizona State University, and who have invested in this project from the early beginnings and have been so helpful, providing the Thinc Design team professors and deans to help inform the great work that they have done. So let's get started here. You'll be hearing from each of them. We have had several big public meetings and hundreds of small meetings, and based on all of that input, you're going to hear several things that I think are going to surprise and please you. First and foremost, we're presenting a new location. We have moved the Desert Discovery Center, now the Desert Edge, to a different location where the maintenance building was before, where equestrian staged, so that we could preserve that site at the gateway for people who currently enjoy that experience. We also moved non-essential facilities and put additional parking at an off-preserve site nearby, but still just trying to keep as much of the activity away that we possibly could. And the architecture, as you will see, literally recedes into the desert. So it's barely visible from surrounding neighborhoods. And the gateway itself, so it really is an edge. And as you can see by our new signage outside, we do have a new name for a new project, the Desert Edge. Edge encounters, discovery, and global education. We think that that really describes the things that we want to bring to this project and is a beautiful new name for a beautiful new project, Desert Edge. And we are on the edge of a lot of things. We're on the edge of the desert. The world is on the edge of being warmer and drier, and so we think that the research that goes on here is going to be critically important going forward. So we do present this new vision, a new name, Desert Edge. And I want to share just a few couple of statistics with you as we begin. The pavilions will be about 47,000 square feet, just like the size of your home, maybe 2,500 square feet. The Desert Edge will be 47,000 square feet. This small footprint will be on 5.34 acres. We were given 30 acres to look at, but we shrunk this down to under 6 acres. And as I mentioned, we're very sensitive about parking because that's really what the biggest visual blight might be. And all of the parking will be contained in that current footprint of parking that's at the gateway. The off-preserve facility will house most of our administration and accommodate about another 250 spaces of overflow parking. The capital cost, we estimate to be $61.2 million. That's significantly less than what the original cost was represented to be, and of course there's been inflation over these ensuing years, but still we think that this is something that is very affordable and very doable from Scottsdale. And we think that this could involve no new taxes, that there are 2 dedicated income streams that could be used for this, and we think that that would be appropriate, even though ultimately that's a council decision. And of course our nonprofit is taxed with bringing 10% of what the capital costs would be to this. So different than a library that you might build or a fire station, you have a private partner that has demonstrated the ability to raise these kinds of funds. And this nonprofit, who's made up of some of the very founders of the McDowell-Sonoran Preserve, we stand ready and able to bring that 10% of capital cost. So we anticipate that our business plan also backs this up. About $4.6 million is needed in earned revenue, plus another $1.7 million in non-earned revenue. We think that's very doable, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but we hope that that would let you relax and enjoy the presentation that we're about to give you. See, to make all of this happen,
I'm just going to talk very briefly about the interpretive goals. The first time I came onto the site, I was just blown away by the beauty and the complexity of it. A kind of desert that I had never seen before. And as we began to think about what we could do, we also benefited from, frankly, a lot of the back and forth from people opposed to it, people for it, but really listening to a wide range of opinions that caused us to go really deeply into why it's important to build this and what it can accomplish. And we came up with a sort of North Star for the project, which is living in the desert. And for us, that's looking at the desert and understanding what lives there and how it lives there. But it's also about us living in the desert. It brings it home to Scottsdale and to cities around the world that are living in drier and drier places. This came up, this developed into kind of 4 questions that guide the interpretation. One of them is simply looking out into the desert. What's out there? What can you see? The second thing is the reverse of that. What can't you see? What's hidden from view? What are the ecological connections? What are the changes in weather, in season that you can't see at any given visit? The third thing, what can we learn from that? What does it teach us? What does it teach us about living in the desert, about the way we can live in the desert? And the fourth thing is, taking all of this into account, what does it tell us about the future we're creating? How does it guide us to think about the future we want to create, living in a place like this? And how do we shape our own lifestyle? How do we shape our relationship with this beautiful place going forward into a future? So that's the kind of broad goal of the interpretive plan. I'm going to come back and talk about the details in a little bit.
So as the architect for the project, before we put any line to paper, we thought it was prudent to really set the goals of what the architecture wanted to achieve. And as many of you know, I was involved in the phase 2 feasibility study. And so I had listened and learned from a lot of the comments, and they evolved into a lot of the goals that you see listed here. I'm not going to go over every one of them, but just a few highlights. One of the things that was really clear to us was making the project have a minimal visual impact, so that we not only minimized any of the change for the experience one has as you currently experience the Gateway, but also minimizing the visual impact from the adjacent neighborhoods. The other was really beginning to understand I really wasn't building a building. What I was really doing was designing a tool that Tom and his team could utilize in the interpretive side, the experience side of coming to the Desert Discovery Center. So those and many other goals began to compound throughout the design project that's been going on now for a little over a year. Through that year, we did a lot of listening. We had some large community events, which many of you attended. In the one in November, I invited anyone who wanted to stop by our office and just talk with us about the project. Some of you took us up on that, and we had those conversations. As Sam mentioned, we had numerous other conversations with groups, with individuals, and all of it began to filter into our thinking as it relates to evolving beyond phase 2. The work was done in our offices, which are right on the corner of McDonald Drive and Cattle Track. Many of you may know that area. We dedicated a room for the last year and a half to this that's really kind of a think tank to the Desert Discovery Center. What we did was compile and put in that room every document that's ever been really written or drawn as it related to the idea of the Desert Discovery Center, which many of you know has been around for many years. And what we didn't want to do was leave any good idea on the cutting room floor, and we wanted to really clean off the table some of the ideas that really didn't seem to be welcomed by the majority of the community as we listened. Go back to that one. One of the other ways we prepared ourselves was to begin to understand what I began to term as the architectural typology of the preserve. So there is an emerging family of architecture that has been built in the preserve by a lot of other fine architects that really begins to speak to the right kind of buildings to build in the preserve. We know that they have a feeling of almost being transparent through some of their large, almost pavilion feeling by the cantilevers of the roof. We know they're materials that are rugged and materials of the desert. I was not being hired to design a showstopper, show-off building. I was being hired to design a building that would sit respectfully on the site that we were given. And so I was informed by these images. Many of you maybe have never seen all these together, but these are the buildings that currently reside in the preserve. So as Sam mentioned early on, we were given a 30-acre bubble, really by the city, as a study area. Now that number has been kicked around. Some people thought it was the size of the project. It was never that. It was really just a bubble applied to paper and said, generally do your study within this area. And so we did start the work to the north of the gateway, as many of you know that site, which is the one on the left. And as we began to look at that, a lot of parallel paths began to form. Tom's work and his team was beginning to evolve concepts, and we began to think about all the building had to be very place-based. We weren't trying to design a refrigerated box that we put you in to explain the desert. We wanted the experience to be one with the desert. So we began to look and analyze this site on the left in those terms. The other thing we did was we spent a lot of time on site. We talked to hikers as they put on their hiking shoes or running shoes in their trunks as they kind of made their way to Gateway. We understood what that entrance experience was like as you drive in up Carla Way off of Thompson Peak Parkway, and you go through that beautiful stretch of desert before you curve around and park in the parking lot. And we began to get the feeling that our building would be very exposed there. It's slightly higher in elevation than Gateway, so that was not adding to our minimizing the visual impact. And we began to start wondering at the same time, a lot of parallel paths again, around November, so that was when we had the last big group meeting. We had said, well, maybe we don't have to put everything here. I know there are people in the audience who wish we maybe don't have anything here, but what we began to look for is some degree of compromise from what we were hearing, and we said, okay, what if we begin to look at non-essential uses and look for a satellite or a support site that could minimize the impact of what we're putting on the ground at Gateway. So we began to say, well, overflow parking on very busy days would be one. We don't want to build a bunch of offices. Offices are needed to administer something like this. We don't want to build a lot of storage. Those are just things that none of us would want to see in the preserve. At the same time, Tom's team was looking at very in-depth parts of the desert that weren't showing themselves on this original site. So we began to look at really alternative site locations within Gateway. And so one day our team was on a hike, and we were over behind the existing maintenance building. And we began to ask ourselves, well, is this parking lot here where the trailer parking is, how utilized is that? The experience to the south of the maintenance building was richer. There was a desert, a wash there that we felt could become part of the interpretive experience. We felt that because it's roughly anywhere in the footprint of this, say 14 to 21 feet in elevation, lower than the floor of Gateway, that it would help minimize the visual impact. We were beginning to study the heights of the buildings and realized we had no need to go higher than current Gateway in our heights. So we then went back to the city and we said, we think the site on the right is a better site. So this is the current maintenance building. This is the current equestrian parking. And this is some of the existing drive and the later parking that was built there. So the drawings that you've seen in the lobby and you'll see here in the presentation are all focused on that site. Like architects do, they like to scribble and make everyone believe their little sketches are really important. These are just field sketches that my team and I did, just looking at responsive spaces to the desert, to the interpretive plan, appropriate to Gateway, and kind of sketching our way around the site. And the only reason I put these up here is there are numerous of these, and I just wanted everyone to know that as an architect, you don't just end up with the end solution at the beginning. You go through volumes of ideas that you hope to make better, some simply you discard. We began to think of these buildings not as buildings, but as what I term, and this is a term I used in phase 2, of linked desert pavilions. As Sam said, I was a student at the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, and as a student, I lived in the desert. Probably that land, if it wasn't Taliesin West, would have been in the preserve at some point. But I would wake up in the morning in what was a pavilion form, and I would begin to really live in the desert. I understood what it was like for the smell of the creosote after a rain. I began to feel and knew the washes and the breezes that come down from them at different times of the day, understood the washes as a lifeline, and began to think that form, that pavilion form, began to blur the line of indoor-outdoor. And it was very compatible with this emerging architectural typology of the preserve. As Tom began to evolve the work, and Duke and ASU were participating deeply in our discussions, we began to simply outline all of the spaces. So I'm not going to go through these. I doubt you can even read them. But they're online, which I think many of you have already gone to, is a very in-depth report. There's actually 5 of them that comprise all of our team's efforts. And this would be what we call the architectural program. That program grosses out with a square footage of 47,000 square feet. Now, comparing apples to apples, because some have interpreted the numbers that we put in here in different ways, which is fine because you can add things together in very different ways. This number, for clarity, would be the outside of the outside wall of those spaces that are fully enclosed. So that is the same way I calculated the square footage in the phase 2 feasibility study, where the numbers were around 70-some thousand square feet. So we are considerably less in square footage. Now, we do have roof overhangs. We do have a very unique shade panel that shades some of the connected courtyards. And so if you want to add that in, that figure would traditionally be known more as coverage. The city has asked us to put these numbers in the report in this way because they are used in the analysis of what is called the MUMPS plan. MUMP is an acronym for the Municipal Use Master Site Plan. That's a process the city uses to process their own buildings, and we filed that document yesterday, and that will start making its way through the various commissions, and we'll show you that schedule at the end of the presentation. So we took those numbers and we began to simply space them out on the site in what we call a space and flow diagram. We're beginning to work with Thinc and say, okay, these kind of spaces want to be here or there. What is the flow like? How do we, in times of a large amount of people, deal with dispersing of a crowd within this? What are the impacts of certain spaces in certain area? How does that space affected by the sun? Can we arrange spaces so they self-create shade within the courtyards themselves? So that's all done in these space and flow diagrams, of which this was the final version. And to just orient you once again, this area is the current equestrian parking. And as I get into my site plan, I'll show you how we're repurposing that. This would be a drop-off for buses. This would be where you enter, and this is the existing building. Other points of interest is this is the existing Bahada Trail. Many of you know that. And then there are other view and solar angles shown on this site. This is the overall site plan. Some of you viewed this out in the lobby. It is a series of really 8 of these pavilion forms that are linked by a series of shaded canopies or courtyards. And just some of the highlights of the site are we, in working with our traffic engineers in the city, are recommending that there be a second entry added into the gateway area, which would be in the south. This is the little wash. It would just be past that. That would be ingress only, and that would keep Carla Way exactly as it is now. So most of the Desert Edge visitors could enter into this side, and most of the hikers could enter in here as they always have. This would be our main entry coming into a central zone of what we call the Sonoran Steps. This is called the pod, and there's various names for the other pavilions, which Tom will get into as we evolve this. So what we've done is we've taken that equestrian parking and basically reformed it. We'll revegetate it and create it now for passenger vehicles. We are adding this parking here, and that parking was previously envisioned and actually approved in the what's called the MUMPS plan, which was the plan that was filed for the original gateway that allowed the original building to be built. So that's parking that was always envisioned there. So as we looked at parking, we said parking could actually become the major visual impact. So let's minimize it. Let's kind of read the tea leaves as to what feels like the right amount of parking to be here without over-compromising the site or compromising the site. And then let's look for an alternative support site that using shuttle vehicles, we can bring people there, or parking management plans. So what we now have is this loop area of drive, and we will keep all of the parking confined to that. This is a blow-up of that same plan, but superimposed with an aerial photograph of the vegetation. So obviously, we are analyzing where all of the major plants are, where the saguaros, the kind of plants that you really don't want to be moving. And how can we make this architecture work with that? Well, with this pavilion form of architecture, we can push and pull and angle change. A lot of these angles are set up with view sheds to views that Tom and his team want to bring inside of that pavilion and interpret, and he'll bring you through that in a bit. And then we now are going to take you through, so this, a blow-up of this plan. So these are the various spaces as we enter the desert edge. This will be our main entry portal. No big gates out front. The idea is that we will take the existing maintenance building and repurpose this wall area here, and that will be for ticketing. But just like you now board airplanes with your telephone and you do a lot of your ticketing online, we don't envision a lot of on-site sales. There always will be that, but it won't be the idea of a long queuing line waiting for your tickets. Most of it will be through some kind of technology of reading your phone just like you do it getting on a plane. So you'll come in. We think in the entry that it's a marvelous place to tell the story of the preserve, the great history that produced this, that this city came together and taxed itself so many times and developed the fund to acquire the land. And we want to get that right out front through interpretive panels as you're drawn in. As you come in, you'll go over the first little wash here, and the idea is that we'll have a metal grating go over that wash just like you do when you leave the gateway and embark on a trail into the preserve. We'll do that same. Additionally, this is what's called the Equestrian Bypass Trail now. It's the trail that's there. We will leave that there and leave it open. That will not be buried into the fee portion of the DDC. It will always be open. So in essence, this is almost like another trailhead. And additionally, our first set of restrooms will be accessible for any of those hikers who come through this portal of entry. We then will bring you by what we call the commons. Yes, we will have a food and beverage component to this, modest in size, along with a small market of very highly curated elements for sale, books and things, but all very specific. So there's not any kind of discussion going on in the team of, selling a lot of tourist tchotchke here. This is very high level, highly curated materials. And then you'll see at the bottom of that first pavilion, these are the restrooms that are available to hikers who might come in here. Then one of the things we want to do is pull you in immediately to a great view. And we also want to expose you to programs and educational opportunities right up front. So we've created an area we call the Sonoran Steps. This is a little bit from me spending a lot of time on various university campuses and just watching students sit on walls and steps and things, and said, why don't we have that kind of outdoor educational experience in kind of an artistic way? So we're not going to try to line you up like little pigeons in an amphitheater, but a very unique one so that we can have this very dynamic, different place. So we might congregate a few people over here or over here, depending on the various program. But that's something you'll observe right up front, and you have the great backdrop of the mountains behind that.
So as I said, the first time we came to the site, its beauty was the thing that sort of struck me and struck my team. This extraordinary diversity in a desert and a kind of landscape that we just wanted to soak in. And as we've come to know the material better, as we've come to know the site better, and as we've come to speak to a huge range of people with knowledge about it, clearly it became more than the desert. And we began to think about the plan and the interpretive plan and the way the experience could lay out as directing our views towards specific aspects of this environment. So When I talk about the 4 questions at number 1, what's in front of us, it becomes much clearer for people if I point you in a direction and frame a view and focus on one particular aspect after we've come in and taken the whole site in as an entry. So each of the pavilions is focused on a particular view that tells a particular set of stories about this amazing ecosystem and about our relationship to it. But there's also something that we can do here that we can't simply see, and that's this centerpiece in what's called the pod, which is take us on a time-traveling trip, going through the seasons, going through the course of a day, being able to see things that many people who go out there every day may not get a chance to take in a single lifetime. So the pod is a kind of orientation experience. It's a full round theater, but entering into it in this side going in or this side going out, we also have other ways of experiencing those seasons through our senses. So one of them is focused on the smells of the desert, how those smells change through the year with different seasonal plants and different patterns of weather. And the other is how the sounds change, because the ecosystem balance changes and the whole soundscape is different throughout the year. So tuning people to think about these senses as well as the visual sense. And once we're inside this, there's a series of programs that can play that take us through a time-lapse experience, that can take us through different weather events, that can take us through the different seasons, that can show us aspects of the desert that we can't see today because they aren't there today. And a whole range of things that can be used with programming, particularly with school groups or with groups that come in and really want to learn about something specific, that can tune the program to a particular range of interests. So this is a sensory immersion in the desert, kind of fast forward, and also at different scales, being able to go underground. There's lots of shade out there, you just have to go under the ground to get it. And a lot of organisms do that. So being able to take us places we simply can't go otherwise. The different pavilions, aside from that one, take advantage of these view sheds. So the first one I'm going to talk about is about the mountains. And what do the mountains mean? The mountains have a great cultural significance in this part of the world, but they also have an absolutely critical hydrological significance too. The water that feeds this basin is created in the mountains. The rains happen in the mountains. It's captured by the forests, delivered into the valleys. And so this is principally, though not exclusively, a hydrological story of being able to explore how the water that is so scarce here and so carefully managed by all the inhabitants, how that comes to be. So as we look out into the mountains, we can also see, for instance, the upturned root ball of a tree, and as in the forests that are in the north, that capture the rainfall, percolated down into the soil, into the aquifers, that eventually come into the springs and into the rivers as well. And how that distant landscape that seems very far away actually carries over into this immediate landscape right in front of us. And also gives us a chance to explore underground. What happens if you lift up the soil? What do the roots look like? How are they grasping, getting a foothold? What are the burrowing animals that are there? A colony of ants creating its own super colony underground. And also we have a room in there where we can dive in and look at the soil at a microscopic level. And this is a lot of it informed by the research that ASU is doing, and really fills out a view of how this ecosystem functions at all levels. We have the chance to play with hydrology using sand interactives that use digital projection and tactile engagement. We have the opportunity to look microscopically at things and to explore in detail. The Bajada is this grand vista, and we have one pavilion set that has an optimal view of that. And again, when we started to work with ASU, we were impressed just looking out into the landscape at how diverse it is and how unusual that is for a desert. But when we really began to learn how incredibly biodiverse this is, we kind of wanted to create a place where we could just kind of scoop that diversity out of the landscape and bring it into the foreground and begin to give people a chance to explore the ecological relationships that make this place work. So, and to explore the relationships that this landscape has with other landscapes through the corridors of flight corridors, and particularly the nectar corridor, the flight of the insects and bats and other pollinators that go through the region seasonally. So this is an open pavilion that doesn't have walls, just looks out into the landscape, but it's covered. And in it are all of these models tactile models of the organisms that live out there. And when we touch one of them, it lights up a series of connections to others. And we are going to be using augmented reality here as well, so that we can use this device to interpret a lot of things that we can't see as we go through here. And there's also a great opportunity to move out and really get a great vista of the Bajada beyond. But this is another way of seeing it, as a set of ecological relationships. And we begin to unpack that, it becomes much more meaningful and gives people a chance not only to kind of know something about this, but also to begin to be able to have some empathy for the different organisms, the way they cooperate, the way they interact with each other, the way they have adapted to this harsh environment, and the way they thrive in this place in spite of conditions that are, for us, very challenging.
One of the things we wanted to do was, in the initial goals of the experience and the architecture, was to create a place that every time you came back, you were able to have a different experience. A lot of that will come with Arizona State University's programming and the dissemination of the research that is ongoing. A lot of it will happen in our Sonoran Steps area. But another area we created, we call the Sonoran Seasons, which is this pavilion. Sonoran Seasons, really just because seasons change. So we wanted this to be a very dynamic space, a very creative space that we could set up and configure in very many different ways. So the idea of these large panels are big rotating panels, so that the room can have many different configurations, but the idea is that it would be rotating exhibits, it would be places of perhaps symposiums coming to the center, it would be areas that we could have discussions and presentations within, and gatherings that are single topic focused. Like one of the things we're concepting as we go forward is that we might set forth some very major kind of programs that we could do here and no one else is doing, like convene the world's thinkers on the topic of shade. As deserts grow across the world, and we certainly here in the Sonoran Desert, shade is extremely valuable to us. But we don't practice it very much. We still live in houses where shading is not a component of every single home. So are there things that could be talked about in that? They would take place in here. The other area of that pavilion is what we call science encounters. So we envision visiting researchers, visiting scientists coming to study here, to work here, to research here. And these would be open lab spaces that could interact with the public as they conduct their work, and be really an adjunct to what we're doing in Sonoran Seasons. This will be a place that can support activities that would have food and beverage. So we have a catering kitchen here. that would support this if we had some kind of meeting or gathering. Let me tell you what this is not, for clarity. This is not a convention center. It is not a bridal hall. The idea of those two things has never been talked about. But gathering people for important events that center around the understanding of the preserve, the understanding of the Sonoran deserts, the understanding of deserts of the world and how we adapt. That's what we see happening in this space.
So living in the desert. This hasn't always been a desert, and the exciting thing about being able to unpack the history of this place and unpack the views is that we can also time travel. We can also see the story that's written in the rocks going back roughly 1.8 billion years. So one of these pavilions takes a focus to the mountains, which is where a lot of this geology is layered up and visible to us. And a series of evocative rock formations that take a sort of typical form of the strata that are from these different periods and some of the fossils that remain from these periods, from when this was a shallow sea and sometimes a bit of a deeper sea, and as it rose up back some 60-some million years ago to become a whole range of different landscapes. We can explore that inside these, but we can also use, again, augmented reality to bring some of this to life. So taking what we can see in the landscape and bringing it to life and making it more visible. Inside these boulders, we're calling them time boulders, we can also explore in detail what these worlds were like, what kind of creatures inhabited them, and what kind of remains are left behind as evidence in the landscape. I think the most moving place for me in the site is the wash. And one of the things that was great about the moving from the earlier site to this site is it gave us visual access to a really wonderful wash. The wash is the kind of the lifeblood of this part of the desert. And yet you can see that the topography changes, you can see that the plant life changes, but it's almost impossible to really envision it in action. And so this is an opportunity to stand at the threshold of a wash and begin to explore it in greater detail. And we have several different areas that are devoted to that. One of them is simply looking at the variety of plant life, where you have the water and the cooler air. You get a lot of accumulation of and congregation of life. And it's an opportunity to have some living animals as well, with some of our partners in conservation organizations that are looking after, for instance, wildlife that's been rescued. We can bring in tortoises and snakes and small spiders and other small organisms that people can see and have programs with live in this place. We can also bring some of the plants that we can't really get close to in the wash because the wash has only a small trail through it, that we can look at up close. So we bring the topography in close with a view into the real place. But of course, the real action of the wash is what happens when it rains, what happens when it's a river. And so we're using big LED screens and immersive sound and air and effects to portray what happens in a big storm. And this is not only to bring us into the imagination of what this is like, most of us are never there, but also, given particularly what happened in the last month, to teach the safety of staying out of the wash when it rains, that really giving people a sense of how powerful these events are, which is so hard to imagine when it's not happening. So this is a kind of punctuation mark for the journey. Outside here and in other areas on the site, we are employing what we call time windows, which are view scopes where we can look out into a landscape and we'll collect video and digital material that let us see how this changes over the season, what's different in other times of the year, what it looks like at night, what kind of animals are out and about at night, and what happens at times other than when we're here. Time also plays a role with the saguaro. So this is, of course, the keystone species in this desert. It's incredibly important, incredibly iconic. And we're trying to think, what can we do to bring this more fully into people's consciousness? So we have a range of exhibits that you can kind of see and touch that get you closer to these cacti as exhibit elements and the ability to even listen to the sounds inside one. But we also have the opportunity to use saguaro that is actually on the site. It's an older saguaro that we can add a few abstract sculptures around, which become a kind of sundial that creates events at different times of the day and different kinds of the year that show some of the ecological relationships in the shadows that can become an event that can be interpreted and can be accentuated throughout the year as a program. And to this side, you can also see all of these exhibits that are working all the time, including things like just very simple view scopes that are over here that just point at a burrow in a cactus that let you begin to explore who's living there and who made it and what's going on inside one of these great organisms. So this is a little bit of a time lapse of what might happen. We see a bobcat, or how do the seeds get dispersed, or who's pollinating and when. And then finally, the thing that we kind of avoided the first time we were out there is the view back to the city, because the first impulse is to want to just look at this expanse of desert and enjoy the uninterrupted view. But the view back to the city is actually a very important part of the journey, because this is where we really do begin to explore the edge of the desert and the city, which of course is kind of an artificial edge, because the city is in the desert is in the city, and the boundary actually is far more permeable than we often think of it. This is also a place to begin to explore that last question in detail. It's not only in this place, but it's particularly in this place that we can think about the future, because this is where we live in the desert. This is how we live in the desert. And it's an opportunity to really explore some of the current trends around the world, some of the knowledge that is based here, and begin to ask questions about how we want to live here and how we can learn from the things that we see around us how best to live here, about shade, about water, about food, about ecological relationships, and also about the feeling of the desert, the poetry of the desert, the beauty of the desert, and letting that into our beings and developing, for lack of a better term, developing an empathy for this environment that helps us live well with it. So this is a range of exhibits that can change over time, because the edge of knowledge is going to change over time. That one of them in the background here would be about building city blocks and thinking about shade and water and different systems that can be brought to bear, and construct a virtual city and compare that to other cities around the world, or looking at improvements in how we build buildings and houses, collect energy, use water throughout, and also looking back in time at building traditions here and thinking about what are some of the pieces of the past that we can apply to the future productively to live better and live more richly in the present and in the future. This edge is also something that we can explore kind of playfully, because there are, as I said, there's this sense that, and if you look at photographs, sometimes the city just ends, and this is one of those edges where it seems to end. And yet, if you look at wildlife tracking, if you look at where the water goes, if you look at where the water comes from, if you look at heat maps, you can see that the boundaries are very permeable, and sometimes it's difficult to see where one leaves off and the other begins. So being able to challenge those and play with those ideas and let people explore them fully is, I think, a really great opportunity for setting the stage for a different kind of future.
Thank you, Tom. So again, Duke Reiter, Senior Advisor to the President at Arizona State University. And what I'd like to communicate to you, if nothing else, that what's represented in this slide, a bit of the site that's been reserved for Arizona State University, is an uncanny convergence between the motivation of what caused Scottsdale to set aside the largest urban preserve in the United States and the largest university in the United States. I think our interests are manifest in what could happen here and the kind of things that we could contribute to this project. I'd like to say also, before I get started, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Boone, sitting here in the front, Dean of the School of Sustainability. Arizona State was the first university to create such a school. And if you look at our charter here, assuming fundamental responsibility for the economic, social, cultural, and overall health of the communities we serve, having a school that speaks to how this community will thrive and how we'll take good care of the desert that you have set aside is absolutely in our wheelhouse. And the reason that ASU has been designated for the past 2 years as the most innovative university in the United States is because of our ability to partner. Sometimes universities, colleges can be a world apart. They're not engaged with the community. That's absolutely not how we think about ourselves, and we've been rewarded for doing things like this. If you look at the design aspirations that Dr. Crow put in place when he arrived in 2002, leveraging place, using use-inspired research, engaging globally, fusing intellectual disciplines, all of those things can be represented in the preserve and what we think we can bring to it. Through Dr. Boone, Dr. Garcia-Bachel, and others who've been introduced to the design team here, we have immense expertise in this area. We already have it on campus. Can you imagine how attractive it would be to a student or to a scholar to do that work in the very thing that you're studying? So that's why we are so excited about this opportunity. Our research, as I said earlier, is use-inspired. Of course, it happens in labs where certain things have to take place there that are exclusive to that kind of an operation. But we want what we do to be beneficial to the community, and working on the Desert Edge project is a perfect example of how we could demonstrate we're quite serious about doing that. These are just a short list of the conversations that were had between the architects, the exhibit designers, and our faculty that helped to inspire them to say, these are the kinds of issues that need to be presented in this facility. And there's more than that. We had to cut this list down quite a bit here. But to use one example right here, one of the researchers working on this project, who happens to be expert in soil crust, and you might say, well, that seems pretty out there. What meaning would that have for this project? You can tell who we are as a society, what we're doing with our environment, what's in the air, what's in the water, by virtue of examining something that at the microbial level. So these things really do matter. And so we have decided to extend that research through something we're calling the Global Drylands Institute at Arizona State University. We're already underway in putting this together. But again, can you imagine if the studying of something of that kind of importance is actually on the site where the work will be done, how attractive that would be, again, to students and researchers and the faculty that we're trying to bring here to do this kind of work. As Tom mentioned, what a university does, I think, is make the invisible visible. Sometimes we're working with tools that allow things that are so small they could never be seen, of course, by the human eye. But we also have satellites in space at ASU that are looking down on the Earth, and they can tell us something else about the preserve, about this city, and about this place. That's the kind of work that ASU can bring to this. And what we're talking about in the 30,000 plus acres of the preserve is not limited to this place. Desertification is happening across the globe. but we could be the epicenter of the studying of this phenomenon. That could be right here in Scottsdale in partnership with ASU, and people would be coming here from around the globe to understand how to address these issues in other places. We already have partnerships in those places. One of the things that ASU should be doing in this project is opening a window onto the world, that we bring our partnerships to bear on this and allow experts and the kind of people doing this kind of work to make presentations to all of you. That's what should be happening at the Desert Edge. But of course, while we're looking globally, we're not forgetting that our base is here, and that whether it's young people in grade school, junior high, high school, who might be imagining a STEM career, science, technology, engineering, or math, this could be for them a great opportunity to imagine what they might do with their lives. And of course, the current students that we have could be guides on this piece of property, such that we can come there. One of our eager undergraduates or graduates could be majoring in a topic that relates directly to this and helping to guide families on tours, literally in the desert or through the facility. So we see ourselves as an engaged partner, sort of the engine that you don't always see behind this, but providing the content that's really going to make this project go.
So let's go back to the architecture a little bit. I want to go through one last area of the pavilions. This is what we call Desert Keepers. This is kind of how it all happens. So we're repurposing this maintenance building, which I talked about. These are our essential personnel who we think need to be on site in order to properly manage and run the DDC. What I think is a very high-level Scottsdale quality facility. So we all know about our great resorts and this 5-star level they practice. We believe that should come to the Desert Discovery Center as it relates to the greeting and the whole hospitality side of that experience. And so that will require a variety of people on site, but also in our support facility that will be nearby the site. Just a quick glimpse at the roof of this. This is what architects know as the roof plan. Just like the current Gateway building, we intend to take the soil that is below the building, sift it, and put it on the roof to have what we would call a desert roof, so that when you're up higher hiking down, you're not looking at shiny metal roofs or white parapet kind of things like you see in other hilltops. And then we envision linking and shading these pavilions with a very high-tech solar collector canopy, which I'll show you in some of the renderings. The idea of it is that it's energy producing and will also then create shade in the courtyard. So I'm going to take you through a series of 10 perspectives. I think most of you have seen these if you came earlier and viewed them in the foyer. So we sketched around with these renderings, but what is important to know about these is these are very accurate to the vegetation that is on the site. These have not been artistically enhanced. These are actual photographs of the site with the building superimposed within it. So I can take you out there and show you, say, this exact cactus and be able to point to where it is. As we continue through these public hearings, I'm sure we'll want to get into some of that. This is the Bahada Trail that currently exists. This would be our main entry, so you would be coming from the parking area. This would be our loop road. You remember that loop road that we have through the repurposed equestrian parking. You're seeing the existing maintenance building here, so that all exists. This would be our commons area. You're seeing some of the pod area here. So now as you're coming in, you'd be going over this entry bridge that I talked to you about over the small wash that is behind the maintenance facility. You're seeing a little bit of our shade canopy there. The imprint on that is basically when you look at the ground and photograph the casting of a shadow underneath a Palo Verde tree. That is the kind of dappled sunlight that we're trying to achieve through these translucent and flexible solar panels. This is a technology that was developed originally by the U.S. Army as they make their their tents into solar collectors. The Japanese then advanced that into what many of you now know as buildings where the glass themselves is a solar panel. So it's that high technology that we're looking at for this solar shading device. This is the view from what we call the equestrian bypass trail, which is here. This is the existing trail. You're beginning to just see the transparency of these buildings, the pavilion form of it, some of the soaring cantilever forms. The structural systems in this is really the thought of an abstraction of ocotillo branches. And some of the adjacencies to the wash, where we extend out adjacent but not into the wash. That's an area that we had a very long debate and on-site with city staff and our team as to exactly how close we wanted to come to the wash for that experience, but also simply to protect the project itself and not interfere with the wash drainage way. This is our commons area, and then linking over, you can see some of the interpretive panels that are within the linked courtyards. The Sonoran Season courtyard here, and this is the Science Encounter area. These supports, which support the shade canopy, are really the thought of a strong abstract form of a saguaro cactus. Certainly not a literal translation of it, but that strong sentinel feel that a saguaro cactus gives you in the desert. And then some of our more very open air pavilions that are really all about shade. The Sonoran Steps and all the unique ways that school children and others can occupy that area. And presenters here, you see the Bajada Trail in the background and the view beyond. And this is the City Edge Pavilion, where you can see how the wall panels can lift up and open these pavilions. The idea is that on the very beautiful mornings that we have, certainly not with the weather we're having right now, but that we capture some of that cool morning air and then lock it into these thermal mass buildings. These are the suggested building materials, the palette that we would like to use. It is a palette of the desert. This is a palette of the architectural typology of the buildings that exist there. Rammed earth, board-formed rustic concrete, the idea of maybe using more adobe than has been used in the past, weathered steel forms, and then we went into a series of view sheds. We know the adjacencies to those neighborhoods who live around here, McDowell Mountain Ranch, Silverleaf, Wingate Ranch. What would I see? Is this going to block my view? So we worked with city staff in locating points that were not trying to hide, we were not looking for that special point where we could hide the building. These were really picked to be the most highly visible points. So the little key on the right here shows the arrow where our photographer was standing at 5'8" on a certain day in June. These are our pavilions in the red form, the existing parking. And you can, those of you who live in McDowell Mountain Ranch will know this trail. These are our building forms right here. So you can see what we believe they're certainly minimizing the visual impact. And then as we go around, we're now on Thompson Peak. We're looking just a little bit north of the shopping area there along the wash. And you're looking that way. And what you're seeing is a little glimpse here and a little glimpse here. Directly across from Wingate Ranch and the entry in Carla Way with the main entry sign here, you'll see a little bit of the structures here and a little bit of the structures there. As I pointed out to you, the original study area that we had that many of you knew was really to the north of the existing gateway would have been significantly higher in elevation and had actually less vegetation. So as we bring this down, we have the perspective angle of the lower vegetation helping screen our buildings. And then we very early on adapted the idea that none of our buildings would be taller in height from the gateway from its its current finish floor elevation to its roof form, which is roughly 24 feet, and we're less than that. And then lastly, from Silverleaf, looking to the south, probably the most visual impact here is the current gateway building. These would be our little threads of roof line along there. This was just put together with some basic facts, which Sam covered at the beginning of the performance or the presentation, the size. One of the questions we thought we would be asked is the comparison to the Phase 2 feasibility as it relates to the land area. So the area of green is our current proposed site. Working with staff, we established a line which would be the normal line that one would establish around any building in the desert where you would fence it to protect the adjacent vegetation. So that is the dashed line around. So this would be the area of construction. On our proposed site, that is 5.3 acres. On the original Phase 2, and once again, remember that was a feasibility study. That was the original concept layout, and many of you know we didn't take those buildings certainly anywhere near as far as we took them in this phase. And that area is 9.55 acres. So a lot smaller footprint and a lot smaller in size. And these two comparison charts show the red is the Phase 2, the brown. So this is the disturbed area. This is the actual building size. This, I won't go into any detail. There's an exhibit of it out in the lobby. We hope to get to net zero and to lead platinum with these buildings, and this is a sustainability strategy that we'll use to help us get there. That's a process that one evolves really from the beginning of design through the full operations of the facility. And I'll let Sam close with some of the business plan aspects of this.
So as taxpayers, all of us, we wanted to be sure that what we were bringing the City Council and to the citizens of Scottsdale was a sustainable business plan. So we have worked closely with a group called Consult Econ and made some assumptions about how this Desert Discovery Center would operate. They are the best, we think, in providing economic feasibility, management, and planning services to nonprofits all over the United States. And here are some of those assumptions. So we think that this will attract about 306,000 people a year. That's about half as many people who go to the Butterfly Wonderland, about half as many people who go to the Desert Botanical Garden and to the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. So we think that that's a reasonable number for us to operate with. We think that the operating expenses, after going through an entire business plan, and that's all available to you outside over in the Young at Art Gallery, will be about $6.3 million a year, and another 1.7 million, or part of that is 1.7 million, and then the 4.6 million in earned revenue. And that is really comparable to what nonprofits do all over the country and specifically here in the Valley. We've looked at those percentages, and we think that that is exactly what we would be able to do in helping with fundraising and what other successful nonprofits do. In general, we'll be open within the preserve hours, sunrise to sunset, or as we like to call it, desert time, 9 to 5, generally, but maybe earlier when the weather turns hotter during school breaks. And if you live in Scottsdale, then one day a month is free, and it's free on your birthday. Based on public feedback, we also made considerable changes to our cafe and gift shop. No longer destination dining like we might have thought under the prior concept, but a small cafe. And yes, with locally sourced food and drink, including locally sourced wine and beer would be available at lunchtime until closing. And as John said, the store items would be things that are needed by visitors and mementos that really align with our mission that possibly you wouldn't find anywhere else. There are two groups that we are thinking about for educational and then special events. For educational events, there is no rental fee. That'll include symposia with ASU, scientific presentations, meeting for groups that we share a mission with. Those will all be free for rental. But in order to meet a sustainable business plan, we will have rentals We're going to limit those evening to 60 a year. We think that that's important and that that's very sensitive to the neighbors. And those will all be subject to specific rules. If you're going to be there after hours, those few times, you have to park off-site and then be shuttled in and out so as not to be bothersome to the neighbors. Everything, even with those, have to be done at 9 o'clock and even staff out by 10. And of course, you really are confined to the desert edge. Events will make use of approved caterers, and they will have to bring in their own liquor license. We won't even have one. No smoking, of course, no overnight accommodations, and I gotta say it, no Jeep tours, and no pets, just service animals. So finally, we've thought long and hard about what the traffic and parking impacts will be. There'll be a new traffic light at Thompson Peak and Carla Way. I think something that the neighbors are looking forward to anyhow. As John said, a new entry to ease traffic into the desert edge, and off-preserve parking for overflow and events. And in keeping with these items, you know, the use of all the new technology, Uber, Lyft, those kinds of things. So to conclude, we have listened. I think that you can see that, and we have responded to the citizens of Scottsdale and especially to our nearest neighbors. All of our reports are out in the lobby. They're also available to you online on both our website and the city's website. We're going to show a short video right now. We're proud to say that we worked with the students at the University of Advancing Technology, and they brought a great video here to conclude this. You'll recognize Jan Diatri's voice, who narrated it, and the local iHeart radio station donated studio space. So we'll take some time to review and have questions answered out in the lobby after this video, and we thank you for your attention and look forward to the Desert Edge and more conversation. Thank you.
The Sonoran Desert, unyielding beauty, shrouded in mystery, barren at times, and yet wildly abundant at others. Nearly 3 decades ago, Scottsdale residents showed great foresight in initiating a public mandate to conserve these rugged lands that form the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. Now the time has come for the next planned step of the preserve's evolution, with an educational center located at the edge between the urban landscape and preserved lands, helping us to gain a deeper understanding of the unique environment we treasure through encounters, discovery, global insight, and most of all, education.
You know, you can take a piece of land and put a fence around it and say we've preserved it, but that's unsustainable, because if people don't know it and haven't come to love it, then as soon as a better offer comes along, they'll let it go. But if people come to know it and love it, then they'll really be defenders. And if they understand the role it plays, you know, in the greater ecology and the greater conservation in the valley, then they really will protect it.
The guiding principle adopted for the proposed Desert Discovery Center project has been small footprint, big vision. First, the big vision. The center is envisioned as the most important environmental education and research center in the world, focused on desert living and arid lands. Amazingly, this big vision manifests within a small space. Our design team worked not only to create a smaller footprint, but also a smarter footprint. Our architect and experienced designers deliberately situated the site on the edge of the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, looking out at the urban valley and back into the Sonoran Desert and McDowell Mountains, literally on the edge of the urban preserve interface. Initially, the city of Scottsdale identified a 30-acre study area at the gateway to the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. It was envisioned that the proposed Desert Discovery Center project would be located somewhere on that site.
It was an area where things could be put there that weren't appropriate in other parts of the preserve, where the community desired to be left in as pristine a state as possible. It's clear that this is the location where those activities that we don't want in other parts of the preserve, the activities that are going to attract a lot of people, this is where they are to be located.
Originally planned to border the existing Gateway trailhead, the site itself has been moved south. This maintains the current Gateway experience as is without disruption. This newly designed site is dramatically smaller than the previous plan and takes advantage of the existing maintenance building. The design team also carefully examined each aspect of the center and determined whether it contributed to the visitor experience and was necessary to be located within the preserve. As a result, non-essential operations such as some administrative functions, storage, classrooms, maintenance, and overflow parking will be located off-site. Parking will be contained within the approved Gateway parking footprint, and a parking management system allows for smooth ingress and egress to and from the center.
We began to coalesce and weave together an idea that this is not about a building. This is about an environment, a tool for learning, for educating, for enjoying the beauty of the desert.
The architectural design is sensitive to the area and will be in keeping with the 10 existing buildings in the preserve, understated and no taller. The location is sensitive to its neighbors and will be virtually hidden from surrounding homes since it's on a lower plane. Pavilions will be nestled into the site, lessening any visual impact overall. A commons area open during preserve hours will include a small cafe and gift shop with locally sourced nourishments and mementos in keeping with the desert theme. The entire experience is meant to blur the lines between indoor and outdoor experiences, keeping everything in balance.
Remember, this is not a refrigerated box we're bringing you into. It is not a museum. It's a living structure that is very much integrated into the desert and really fulfills a lot of the principles of biomimicry, where we're really interfacing with the desert as one.
The Desert Discovery Center project is meant to enrich each visitor's experience by providing educational experiences for all ages, for those who live near the preserve and those who do not, whether in Scottsdale or in other parts of the country or world.
For me, this center is an evolution of what has to happen so that the entire southern part of the town, no, the entire world can now really see what the preserve is all about.
The center's new concept includes experiences that are firmly grounded in a sense of place based on what is beneath your feet, in front of your eyes, and showcasing those authentic sensory impacts that cannot be experienced on a typical hike or that likely wouldn't be noticeable on any given visit. Each experience answers the question, what is this place? What don't we see? What can we learn from living in the desert? What future do we want to create? The pod dispels the notion that the desert is a barren, lifeless place. It provides a multisensory introduction, including sights, sounds, even aromas of the desert. Bahada is teeming with life, showcasing hundreds of species of desert flora and fauna that call the preserve home. This indoor-outdoor experience showcases the web of life, the Nectar Corridor, and a walk through the existing Bahada Trail. Mountains and valleys provide visitors an interpretive experience to explore the mountains, the forest, and the soil, the three spheres the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and other authentic Native American voices describe as that which is above, on the ground, and below the surface. Tom's Thumb. Deep Time takes visitors back over 1 billion years through the geologic ages that created our current yet ever-changing landscape. That includes Tom's Thumb, the landmark granite spire that rises in the distance, which began as magma beneath the Earth's surface. The Wash, water in the desert, takes people through the drought-rain experience culminating in a walk through a desert wash. City on the Edge teaches visitors how we can learn to live sustainably in the desert and how other parts of the world can benefit from our knowledge and adapt to new conditions.
The things that the Desert Discovery Center are going to be able to offer are those that are are incomparable now as far as an experience just walking or hiking or biking in the preserve, because it's going to cross those boundaries of space and time and understanding. I think an incredible way to learn in both a high-tech and a high-touch way, where they can learn lessons that wouldn't be possible if they were actually to venture into the preserve, because there are many things that are too fragile to see.
Growing the next generation of environmental scientists is perhaps our most critical responsibility. Brilliant young minds will cultivate new techniques that are essential to sustainable life in the desert. The center will feature interactive learning for local children and will be a great resource for schools and field trips. On-site school programs will focus on tactile, hands-on desert experiences that will stir the kids' imagination.
When you get them out in locations where they can do some hands-on learning, experience it in different ways, in exciting ways, that's when you get them wanting to be a part of society's issues, meaning they want to look how to solve these issues, and by learning about the science in this way, they can be part of the solution.
Thanks to the partnership with local conservation and animal rescue organizations, visitors will be able to interact with denizens of the desert. And the educational reach extends beyond the center itself with teaching training programs, lesson plans, and virtual student exchanges with other desert environments. The research conducted at the center will have a global reach thanks to the newly formed Arizona State University Global Drylands Institute. This institute will train a new generation of leaders and students and practitioners and will showcase its research in an interactive way. For some, especially our out-of-town visitors, this will be an introduction to the amazing life and history of the preserve. For those already familiar with the preserve, the center offers ways to deepen and broaden their understanding. For both, the center will make the actual experience of the preserve more vivid and meaningful with dynamic programming and changing exhibits.
You know, we want children to have takeaways, not just to learn something, but some way in which they might take action or change their the way they do things at home, or influence their parents about conservation, about living in the desert, about living in the environment and preserving it going into the future.
This will give us that opportunity to use the center as a focal point for the preserve, not replacing the preserve, but being part and parcel part of it. It's critical, this center is, to the success of education in the preserve.
I'm extremely excited about it. I don't think we're going to find a project any greater than that here in Scottsdale. Our Performing Arts Center, our museums, our Westworld, our Indian Bend Wash, our power that's underground, all of the things that we have successfully done in Scottsdale that went before. I think that the Desert Discovery Center is all of these things rolled into one.
This center, focused on encounters, discovery, global insights, and education, has become something new. Thanks to the past decades of thought, conversation, refinement, and public feedback, the project previously known as the Desert Discovery Center has become Desert Edge at the gateway to Scottsdale's McDowell-Sonoran Preserve. At Desert Edge, everyone, residents, visitors, school children, those of all ages and abilities from all walks of life, will truly be able to access the wonder that is the Sonoran Desert through encounters, through discovery, through global insights, and most of all, through education. Welcome to Desert Edge.